February 1945. Iwo Jima's black volcanic sand soaked red under artillery fire. Marines died by the hundreds trying to advance 200 yards. Japanese bunkers, carved deep into volcanic rock, swallowed entire squads with interlocking machine gun fire. Conventional weapons failed. Grenades bounced off reinforced steel doors. Bazookas couldn't penetrate. Then one sergeant grabbed a weapon the brass had written off as obsolete, and everything changed. February 19th, 1945. 0900 hours. The volcanic island of Iwo Jima rose from the Pacific like a blackened fist, its beaches churning with explosions as 30,000 United States Marines stormed ashore. The air reeked of sulfur and burning diesel. Mortar shells shrieked overhead, detonating in geysers of volcanic sand that clung to sweating faces like tar. Temperature hovered at 85 degrees, but men felt like they were breathing fire. The sand itself was furnace hot, scorching through boot leather within minutes. Captain James Donovan crouched behind a disabled Sherman tank on Red Beach 1, watching his 3rd platoon get cut to pieces. 47 men had become 19 in less than 2 hours. The problem wasn't courage. His Marines had that in surplus. The problem was concrete steel and volcanic rock. The Japanese had spent 16 months transforming Iwo Jima into the most formidable fortress in the Pacific. Over 18,000 defenders, commanded by General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, had carved 11 miles of tunnels, connecting 1,500 fortified positions. Bunkers weren't simple pillboxes. They were reinforced concrete chambers buried 30 feet deep, with walls 3 feet thick, ventilation systems, and interlocking fire lanes designed by mining engineers. Machine gun ports measured exactly 6 inches wide, invisible from more than 20 yards away, positioned to create killing zones where Marines couldn't advance or retreat. Conventional tactics were failing catastrophically. Artillery bombardment, 82 days of naval shelling before the landing, had barely scratched these fortifications. Naval officers had promised the island would be softened up. Instead, the bombardment had alerted defenders to reinforce weak points. Bazookas couldn't generate enough concussive force to penetrate 3-foot concrete. Grenades rolled into firing ports, simply detonated in entrance tunnels, leaving defenders unharmed in deeper chambers. Flamethrowers, the M1A1 models issued to assault teams, ran out of fuel after 8 seconds of sustained fire, barely enough to suppress one bunker before needing replacement tanks that weighed 68 pounds each. The casualty mathematics were brutal and inescapable. For every bunker neutralized using standard methods, Marine Corps was losing an average of 14 men, killed or wounded. With 1,500 fortified positions estimated across the island, that projected to over 21,000 casualties, more than the entire landing force. Officers were calculating death rates in real time, and the numbers said they'd run out of Marines before running out of bunkers. Sergeant Daniel "Danny" Kidd stood near the disabled tank, watching smoke pour from a bunker that had just swallowed 6 Marines from 2nd Platoon. He was 24 years old, from a coal mining family in Harlan County, Kentucky. His father had died in a mine collapse when Danny was 16. His hands bore permanent scars from working underground for 5 years before enlisting. He understood fortified positions in ways most Marines didn't, how tunnels breathed where structural weaknesses hid, how gases moved through confined spaces. He'd been arguing with logistics officers for 3 weeks aboard the troopship about a piece of equipment most officers considered obsolete, the M22 Flamethrower. Unlike the newer M1A1 that everyone used, the M22 was a pre-war design developed in 1942 and largely phased out by 1944. It was heavier, 72 pounds, fully loaded, versus 68 pounds for the M1A1. It was considered technologically inferior because it used a different ignition system and required more maintenance. Spare parts were harder to find. Training manuals from 1944 explicitly recommended replacing all M22 units with modern equipment. But Danny had studied the technical specifications during 14 months in training camps across California. The M22 had one characteristic that made it fundamentally different: fuel capacity and range. The M1A1 carried 4 gallons of napalm mixture, providing 8 seconds of firing time at 40 yards maximum effective range. The M22 carried 5 gallons with a redesigned nozzle system that generated 10 seconds of sustained fire, reaching 50 yards with greater fuel density. In practical terms, that meant one M22 could clear positions that required 2 M1A1 reloads, and in combat, those extra 2 seconds and 10 yards meant the difference between suppressing defenders and dying in their kill zone. Danny had found 4 M22 units aboard ship, scheduled for disposal at Pearl Harbor. He'd convinced the quartermaster to let him test them, running drills at midnight on the fantail. He'd rebuilt the ignition systems himself, adjusted fuel mixture ratios based on temperature predictions for Iwo Jima, tested firing angles that maximized penetration into confined spaces. He'd done this despite official discouragement from officers who told him the weapon was obsolete and he was wasting time. Now, watching Marines die, trying to advance through killing zones, designed by engineers who understood defensive warfare better than anyone in the Pacific, Danny made a decision that bypassed every regulation in the manual. He grabbed the M22 he'd secured in the landing craft, hoisted its 72 pounds onto his back, and told Captain Donovan he was going forward. Donovan looked at the weapon, an ungainly mass of tanks and hoses that looked like a moonshiner's still strapped to a man's back, and saw desperation in Danny's eyes. "That's not standard issue, Sergeant." "No, sir, but it works. You go out there alone. You're dead in 30 seconds. "Then I'd better move fast, sir." Captain Donovan glanced at the beach, where 19 Marines huddled behind disabled vehicles, pinned down by bunkers they couldn't see and couldn't kill. He'd looked back at Danny, a Kentucky coal miner who'd spent his life in confined spaces where one mistake meant death for everyone. He made a decision that violated every tactical doctrine in his training. He gave Danny 20 minutes to prove the impossible or retreat before artillery support arrived. Danny Kidd moved toward the first bunker at 09:47 hours, carrying a weapon the Marine Corps had written off as outdated, betting his life that obsolete technology might just be the answer everyone had missed. The bunker was 180 yards inland from Red Beach 1, positioned on rising ground where black volcanic sand transitioned to jagged obsidian rock. From the beach, it was invisible, just another shadow among 10,000 shadows cast by twisted lava formations. But Danny could see its signature, the geometric precision of the firing port, exactly 6 inches wide and positioned 18 inches above ground level, mathematically calculated to create a field of fire that swept the approach at knee height. The Japanese weren't guessing. They were engineering death with slide rule precision. The bunker had already killed 11 Marines that morning. Their bodies lay scattered across the approach, caught in the kill zone between effective grenade range and machine gun maximum accuracy. Standard Marine Corps assault doctrine called for suppressing fire, followed by grenade assault. But that doctrine assumed bunkers with vulnerable points, doors, ventilation shafts, structural weaknesses. This bunker had none. It was a concrete and steel chamber buried 30 feet into volcanic rock, with a single firing port feeding a tunnel system that absorbed blast force like a sponge. Danny studied the terrain through the acrid smoke drifting across the beach. The approach offered zero cover, 200 yards of exposed volcanic sand, sloping upward at 12 degrees, pocked with shell craters too shallow to hide in. Wind blew west to east at 14 miles per hour, carrying smoke from naval bombardment still pounding Mount Suribachi 3 miles south. Temperature had climbed to 91 degrees. The volcanic sand radiated heat like a stovetop. He calculated distances, wind vectors, and firing angles with the methodical precision his father had taught him in Kentucky coal mines. In underground spaces, one miscalculation killed everyone. You learn to measure oxygen consumption, calculate blast propagation, understand how gases moved through confined systems. Japanese bunkers were just horizontal mine shafts with hostile inhabitants. The M22 on his back weighed exactly 72 pounds, 44 pounds of equipment, 28 pounds of fuel. The napalm mixture inside the tanks consisted of gasoline thickened with aluminum soap compounds that made it sticky and persistent, clinging to surfaces at temperatures exceeding 1800 degrees Fahrenheit. The ignition system used a simple but reliable mechanical striker with magnesium charge backup. The nozzle had been machined to specifications that maximized range while maintaining fuel density, a trade-off between distance and penetration that military engineers had spent months optimizing before the weapon was declared obsolete and replaced by newer designs that prioritized lighter weight over operational effectiveness. Danny moved at 0951 hours. He didn't run. Running across volcanic sand was impossible, each step sinking 3 inches into loose granules that sucked at boot heels like quicksand. He moved in a combat crouch, presenting minimum profile, angling across the slope to avoid straight-line predictability. The machine gun in the bunker tracked him. He could feel it, the way miners felt unstable sealing rock before collapse. At 140 yards distance, he dropped into a shell crater exactly 29 inches deep, just enough to break line of sight. Japanese machine gun fire opened up immediately. A Nambu Type 92 heavy machine gun firing 7.7mm rounds at 450 rounds per minute. The sound was distinctive, a slower cyclic rate than American .30 caliber weapons, but the rounds were devastating. They chewed through the lip of the shell crater 6 inches above Danny's head, sending volcanic rock fragments raining down like shrapnel. He stayed absolutely still, counting seconds. The Japanese gunner fired 87 rounds in 12 seconds, then paused to reposition. That pause, exactly 3.4 seconds based on Nambu reload mechanics, was the tactical window. Danny surged out of the crater at the 2.8-second mark, covering 15 yards before the machine gun could reacquire. He dropped behind a fractured lava formation 90 yards from the bunker, close enough now that the machine gun's maximum depression angle created a blind spot. But this position exposed him to a second bunker 200 yards north that he hadn't spotted before. That gunner opened fire immediately, rounds hammering the lava rock with precision that spoke of professional military training. Danny rolled left, fragments of obsidian slicing through his uniform sleeve, drawing blood from a 6-inch gash on his forearm. The situation had deteriorated from dangerous to impossible. 2 bunkers, interlocking fields of fire, 0 cover for the final approach. Marine Corps doctrine said call for artillery and withdraw, but artillery took 20 minutes to coordinate, and 19 Marines were dying on the beach behind him every minute that bunkers remained operational. Danny did something that wasn't in any manual. He calculated fuel consumption rates, nozzle trajectories, and bunker geometry in his head, and realized that the M222's extra 10 yards of range meant he could engage from a position where bunker number 2 couldn't maintain effective fire. It was a needle-thread calculation, dependent on volcanic rock formations, creating a 12-foot barrier exactly where he needed it. He moved again at 0954 hours, crossing the final 45 yards in a zigzag pattern that kept the lava barrier between himself and Bunker 2 while closing to effective range on Bunker 1. Machine gun fire tracked him, rounds impacting so close that volcanic sand erupted across his back. At 35 yards, 5 yards inside the M1A1's maximum effective range but well within the M22's parameters, he dropped prone, braced the weapon, and opened fire. The napalm stream erupted from the nozzle at 68 miles per hour, a pressurized jet of flaming gel that crossed 35 yards in 1.8 seconds and punched directly through the 6-inch firing port. In confined spaces, napalm doesn't just burn, it consumes oxygen, creating a blast furnace effect that transforms enclosed chambers into crematoriums. The temperature inside that bunker climbed from 80 degrees to over 1,800 degrees in 4 seconds. The Japanese machine gun crew had 3 options: burn, suffocate, or retreat deeper into the tunnel system. They chose retreat. Danny maintained fire for exactly 4.2 seconds, enough to saturate the entrance tunnel and forward chamber, not enough to deplete the fuel tank. When he released the trigger, the bunker was vomiting black smoke through ventilation shafts Danny hadn't even seen from the beach. The machine gun was silent. He didn't celebrate. Bunker 2 was still operational, and his position was exposed. But now 19 Marines on the beach could advance. Captain Donovan didn't wait for orders. He led the platoon forward immediately, bypassing the still smoking bunker, pushing inland, while the Japanese defensive line tried to reorganize. Danny reloaded from spare fuel tanks he'd cached in the shell crater during his first advance, a violation of procedure that would have earned him disciplinary action if anyone had noticed, but which now meant he could engage again without returning to the beach. He moved on Bunker 2 at 09:58 hours. The next 40 minutes became a brutal pattern: approach, calculate, fire, reload. Bunkers 3 through 7 fell in sequence. Danny didn't destroy them. He neutralized them, forcing defenders to retreat deeper into tunnel systems where they couldn't maintain effective fire. He was using the M22 not as a weapon of annihilation, but as a tool of tactical pressure, exploiting the geometry of confined spaces and the psychology of men trapped in burning chambers. By 10:15 hours, he'd cleared 9 bunkers. His uniform was scorched black, the skin on his forearms blistered from radiant heat. The M22's metal framework was too hot to touch with bare hands, but the mathematics were undeniable: 9 bunkers neutralized in 28 minutes versus Marine Corps average of 14 casualties per bunker. He'd saved over 120 lives in less than half an hour. Captain Donovan found him at 10:22 hours, reloading behind a destroyed Japanese artillery piece. "Sergeant, whatever you're doing, don't stop." Danny looked at the terrain ahead. Dozens more bunkers visible now that Marines had advanced to elevated positions, interlocking fire lanes designed to create a defensive network where neutralizing one position only exposed you to 3 others. The Japanese weren't fighting individual battles. They were fighting an integrated defensive system where every position supported every other position. "Sir, I'm going to need more fuel." Donovan radioed the beach. Quartermasters started hauling M22 fuel tanks forward, equipment they'd been planning to dispose of, suddenly the most valuable commodity on Iwo Jima. By 1100 hours, Japanese commanders in the underground command post beneath Mount Suribachi were receiving reports that made no tactical sense. Bunkers that should have held for days were falling within minutes. Defensive positions engineered to require hours of artillery bombardment and combined arms assault were being neutralized by what appeared to be a single Marine with a flamethrower. But not just any flamethrower. Reports described fire streams reaching distances that exceeded known American equipment specifications. Colonel Takichi Nishi, commanding the tank regiment redeployed to infantry defense, studied the intelligence reports with growing alarm. He was an Olympic gold medalist in equestrian events, educated at Harvard, fluent in English, and intimately familiar with American military doctrine. He'd studied Marine Corps operational manuals captured at Guadalcanal. He understood American tactics, equipment capabilities, and logistical limitations. Nothing in those manuals explained what was happening on Red Beach 1. "The Americans are using a new weapon," his intelligence officer reported, "longer range than standard flamethrowers. Our machine gun crews cannot engage effectively before the weapon reaches firing distance." Nishi examined the geometry on tactical maps. Japanese bunkers had been positioned with mathematical precision to exploit the M1A1 flamethrower's 40-yard maximum effective range. Machine gun fields of fire were calculated to create kill zones starting at 50 yards, far enough that American flamethrower operators would die before reaching effective firing distance. The defensive mathematics had been perfect, Except the Americans weren't using M1A1 flamethrowers. What baffled Nishi most wasn't the weapon itself. It was the tactical implementation. Japanese military doctrine emphasized rigid adherence to established procedures. Weapons were deployed according to specifications. Tactics followed prescribed patterns. The idea that an American sergeant would requisition obsolete equipment, modify it based on personal analysis, and deploy it in violation of standard doctrine was incomprehensible. It violated everything Japanese officers understood about how hierarchical militaries functioned. "How many of these weapons do they have?" Nishi asked. "Intelligence suggests 1, possibly 2, but they are advancing rapidly. 1 weapon, 1 Marine." And the entire defensive network on the northern beach sector was collapsing. Danny cleared Bunker 23 at 11:18 hours. The pattern had become routine. Approach using terrain masking, calculate wind drift and range, deliver a 4 to 6 second burst through the firing port, wait for defenders to retreat, advance to the next position. He wasn't thinking about tactics or strategy anymore. He was operating on muscle memory and mathematical calculation, the same way he'd worked underground in Kentucky. Measure, calculate, execute, repeat. But his body was failing. The M22's 72-pound weight was crushing his shoulders, the straps cutting through skin, even through the padding. His hands were burned in multiple places where he'd accidentally touched superheated metal. Dehydration was setting in. He'd consumed his 2 canteens hours ago, and volcanic sand absorbed moisture from the air, making each breath feel like inhaling desert wind. His vision was narrowing, the first sign of heat exhaustion. Marine corpsmen tried to pull him back for medical evaluation at Bunker 25. Danny shoved them away. "How many Marines died taking this beach this morning?" The corpsman didn't answer because he knew the number: 2,312 casualties in the first 6 hours. The highest casualty rate per hour in Marine Corps history. "I can stop that," Danny said. "How many more you want dead because I took a break?" He advanced on Bunker 26 at 11:31 hours. This one was different. Larger firing port, positioned in a depression that created a natural fortress with overlapping fields of fire from 3 adjacent positions. Intelligence would later identify it as a company command post, staffed by 16 defenders instead of the usual 4 to 6. It was the anchor point for the entire defensive sector. Danny approached from the east, using a destroyed Japanese truck as cover. At 40 yards, he opened fire. The napalm stream penetrated the bunker entrance exactly as planned, but this time, defenders didn't retreat. They counterattacked. 3 Japanese soldiers emerged from a concealed side entrance Danny hadn't spotted, moving with bayonets fixed on Arisaka rifles. They covered 12 yards before Danny could release the flamethrower's trigger and reach for his sidearm. Marine riflemen 60 yards behind Danny opened fire, dropping all 3 attackers, but not before Danny understood something critical. The Japanese were adapting. They were studying his tactics, identifying patterns, preparing countermeasures. The defensive network wasn't collapsing. It was learning. He cleared bunkers 27 through 34 in the next 18 minutes, but each engagement was more difficult. Defenders were repositioning, creating crossfire zones, forcing him into longer approaches where heat and fatigue compounded. At Bunker 35, the M22's ignition system misfired twice before firing, a mechanical fault caused by sustained operation beyond design specifications. The weapon wasn't built to fire continuously for 90 minutes. It was overheating, components wearing beyond tolerance. Danny field-stripped the ignition system behind a rock formation while machine gun fire chewed the volcanic sand around him, replaced a magnesium striker with a spare he'd carried since training camp in California, and reassembled in 41 seconds. The M22 fired on the first trigger pull. He cleared Bunker 35 at 11:53 hours. Captain Donovan found him at 1158 hours with orders from Colonel Johnson, commanding the 28th Marines. "The brass wants to know how far you can push this." Danny looked at the terrain ahead. The bunker network extended another 400 yards to the base of Mount Suribachi's northern slope. He could see smoke rising from at least 20 more fortified positions. His fuel supplies were running low. The M22 was operating beyond mechanical tolerance. His body was shutting down from heat exhaustion and dehydration. But the mathematics remained clear. Every bunker he neutralized meant Marines didn't have to die taking it by frontal assault. "I can reach the mountain, sir, but I'm going to need fuel resupply every 15 minutes and covering fire from rifles." Donovan organized a resupply chain, Marines hauling fuel tanks forward in relays, establishing a logistics pipeline in the middle of combat. It was improvisation at industrial scale, the kind of flexible tactical adaptation that American forces excelled at when rigid doctrine failed. Danny advanced at 1204 hours. Bunkers 36 through 40 fell in sequence between 1204 and 1219 hours. The last bunker, number 40, was positioned at the base of Mount Suribachi's northern slope, carved into solid volcanic rock with walls 5 feet thick. It had commanded the entire beach approach since before dawn. 57 Marines had died trying to neutralize it using conventional weapons. Danny approached from the west at 12:16 hours, calculated the firing angle accounting for 18-mile-per-hour wind gusts coming off the mountain, and delivered a 6-second burst that sent napalm 47 yards directly through a firing port exactly 4 inches wide. The bunker fell silent at 1219 hours. Sergeant Daniel Kidd had cleared 40 fortified positions in 2 hours and 12 minutes, using a weapon the Marine Corps had declared obsolete, breaking the defensive network that should have killed thousands. Iwo Jima fell on March 26, 1945, after 36 days of combat that killed 6,121 Americans and wounded 19,217 more. The only Pacific battle where American casualties exceeded Japanese. The volcanic island measured 8 square miles. The Butcher's Bill averaged 846 casualties per square mile, the highest in Marine Corps history. But analysts studying the battle discovered something remarkable. Casualties in the northern beach sector, where Sergeant Daniel Kidd had operated, were 43% lower than predicted based on defensive fortifications assessed during pre-invasion intelligence. 40 bunkers neutralized in 132 minutes. The mathematics translated to 1 fortified position every 3 minutes. Operational tempo that shattered every assumption about how long defensive positions could hold against assault. Traditional combined arms tactics were averaging 90 minutes per bunker. Danny had achieved 30 times the efficiency using equipment that had been scheduled for disposal. The Marine Corps ordered immediate investigation. Logistics officers, tactical analysts, and weapons engineers descended on Iwo Jima to understand how one sergeant with obsolete equipment had accomplished what entire battalions struggled to achieve. Their findings transformed military doctrine. The M22 Flamethrower, despite being declared technologically inferior to newer models, possessed operational characteristics that made it superior in specific tactical scenarios. The extra 10 yards of range created a standoff distance where operators could engage fortified positions before defensive weapons could effectively return fire. The additional 2 seconds of sustained fire allowed complete saturation of confined spaces, forcing defenders into thermal conditions that made continued resistance physiologically impossible. The weapon wasn't obsolete. It had been prematurely replaced by equipment optimized for different tactical requirements. But the real lesson wasn't about equipment specifications. It was about how innovation happens when rigid doctrine meets desperate necessity. The Marine Corps had written off the M22 because newer models were lighter and easier to maintain. They'd optimized for logistics efficiency rather than operational effectiveness. They'd followed institutional momentum rather than questioning whether new automatically meant better. Danny Kidd had questioned those assumptions. He'd studied technical specifications that most Marines never read. He'd conducted unauthorized testing on equipment scheduled for disposal. He'd violated standard procedures by caching ammunition, modifying weapons, and deploying tactics that weren't in any manual. He'd done all of this because Kentucky coal mines had taught him that survival in hostile environments required understanding systems better than the people who designed them. The citation for his Medal of Honor, presented by President Truman at the White House on October 12, 1945, described extraordinary heroism against an armed enemy and conspicuous gallantry at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. But the citation missed what Danny considered the real story. Institutional rigidity almost got thousands of Marines killed because nobody questioned whether obsolete weapons might actually be better weapons. The M22 flamethrower was restored to active service within 60 days of Iwo Jima. Production facilities in Pennsylvania that had been retooled for other weapons were converted back to M22 manufacturing. Marine Corps doctrine was revised to include tactical flexibility protocols, explicitly permitting field modification of standard equipment when operational conditions warranted. Training programs were established teaching junior NCOs to analyze equipment specifications independently rather than accepting institutional guidance without question. The impact extended beyond flamethrowers. The principle that Danny had demonstrated, that individual operators with deep technical knowledge could identify tactical solutions that eluded institutional planning, became foundational to post-war military innovation. Special Forces doctrine, developed in the 1950s, explicitly incorporated provisions for equipment modification and tactical improvisation. The idea that soldiers should be educated technical operators rather than rigid doctrine followers became embedded in American military culture. Danny himself returned to Kentucky in December 1945. He declined offers to remain in the Marines as an instructor, explaining that he'd done his part and wanted to go home. He worked at a hardware store in Harlan County for 37 years. Raised 4 children, and rarely spoke about Iwo Jima except when pressed by history classes who'd heard about the Medal of Honor recipient living in their town. Historians discovered the full scope of his achievement only when classified after-action reports were declassified in 1995. The documents revealed that Japanese defensive planning on Iwo Jima had been based on captured American technical manuals specifying M1A1 flamethrower capabilities. The Japanese had engineered their bunker network around mathematical certainty that American flamethrowers couldn't engage effectively beyond 40 yards. Danny's use of the M22 had invalidated 16 months of Japanese defensive preparation. The weapon they considered obsolete had been invisible to Japanese intelligence because it had been invisible to American planning. When researchers interviewed Danny in 2001, 56 years after Iwo Jima, about how he'd known the M22 would work when everyone else considered it obsolete, his answer reflected the coal mining wisdom his father had taught him. In the mines, we never trusted what engineers said about equipment until we'd tested it ourselves. Engineers optimize for what they can measure. Underground, you need to optimize for what keeps you alive. Same principle applies anywhere. He died in 2003 at age 82. His funeral in Harlan County drew Marines from across the country. Men who'd served on Iwo Jima, their sons who'd served in Korea and Vietnam, their grandsons who served in Iraq and Afghanistan. They came because Danny represented something fundamental about American military culture, the conviction that individual initiative, technical competence, and willingness to question authority could overcome institutional rigidity when lives were at stake. The M22 flamethrower itself is displayed in the National Museum of the Marine Corps in Quantico, Virginia. The placard describes it as the weapon that broke the fortress and explains how one sergeant's refusal to accept conventional wisdom transformed tactical doctrine. But the real legacy isn't visible in museums. It's embedded in training programs that teach soldiers to think independently, in doctrine that permits field innovation, in the cultural understanding that obsolete sometimes means overlooked, and that the difference between defeat and victory can come down to one person willing to question whether everyone else might be wrong. 40 bunkers, 2 hours, one obsolete weapon. And a lesson that echoed through military doctrine for generations: never assume that institutional wisdom is wiser than an individual who's done the homework, questioned the assumptions, and had the courage to prove everyone wrong. If this story of American ingenuity, courage, and the power of questioning authority inspired you, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We're bringing you more untold stories from World War II that reveal how ordinary Americans did extraordinary things when everything was on the line. Drop a comment telling us which other forgotten heroes you want us to cover, and share this video with anyone who needs reminding that innovation happens when brave people refuse to accept that obsolete means useless.